everybody. I'm Max Rose. I work at Sidefx as a senior character UX specialist. And the title of today's talk is The Making of Rocket Boys, creating a full animated scene in Houdini 21. So, about today's talk. So, from August 1st to August 31st, I participated in a 3D community challenge called Rampage Rally. It's a biannual challenge that's run by a 3D artist named Clint Jones. Just a quick show of hands. Does anybody know about this? Does anybody participate in these? I got one over there, got another one. Yeah, Michael, nice. Yeah, so you guys have seen the work that people put out there. It's pretty wild. But of course, once the contest is announced, you have a month to finish your animation. So the rules, they're pretty simple. One artist, no generative AI. So not even for texture creation. You can't even use it for creating textures. You need to follow the provided template. I'm about to show that in just a little bit. But beyond that, you can really do whatever the hell you want. So the whole goal of this challenge is to get into the top 100 montage, which is just a montage of the top 100 submissions. So I think in this particular challenge, there was about 2,600 some odd submissions. So needless to say, it's very difficult to get in. I mean, the level of quality that artists are putting out these days is just ridiculous. I mean, again, this is just one artist within a month, so it's pretty astounding. And for each round, there's thousands of submissions, so the competition is getting more and more and more competitive. So I've done these competitions twice now, well, twice before this one. So that's Chasm's Call up on the top, and that's Endless Engines at the bottom there. And whenever I finish these, you just feel like you just finished a marathon. It's really difficult, but it's really fun, and you always come out of the experience a much stronger artist. So when I made those previous animations, I bounced around a large number of softwares to get it done. I mean, this isn't even the full list. There was more, but I won't get into it. But then I thought this time, okay, cool, I'm working at Sidefx now. Why don't I just try to do the whole thing in Houdini 21? Now, full disclosure, sorry, I did use Marvelous Designer for the clothing and Character Creator for the characters. Again, big time budget here, but beyond that, everything else was done in Houdini. So here is the template for Rampage Rally. Again, the rules are really simple. Don't touch the camera. Match the in and out motion of the proxy vehicle, but beyond that, there's really nothing else. So after a month, this is what I came up with. So in the end, I was pretty happy with how this turned out. It was more or less exactly what I envisioned. It was a lot of work, as these challenges usually are. Of course, there was a few things I wish I had in there. I wanted to get this kind of Force Awakens X-Wing spray in the water, right, when they fly away, but just didn't have enough time. But regardless, I'm pretty happy with how everything turned out. Now, this is my first deep dive into Solaris. Before this project, I had very little experience with LOPs and the overall workflow. So not only did I have a very few amount of time against me, right, but I had a lot of learning to do. I had to learn how to do all this. So what we're looking at, this is like the bird's eye view of the finished product in Solaris. So the way I did this, I segmented the project into the streams of data, and I found it much easier to focus on each individual section of the pipeline working this way. And what's great about this end product is that I never had to jump from project to project, right? So with the exception of the CC4 rig that I made, the character rig, which I easily could have put into this, everything was done just in a single project. So there's no jumping around from project to project. So that's modeling, rigging, texture creation, everything. And within those streams, these individual blocks here, these are just basically assets. So they could be anything from like an animated character, particle sim, flock of birds, lighting setup, anything. Now, to give this talk a little bit of structure, I'm going to focus on each of these individual streams. I'm going to start with modeling and asset creation, move on to animation and rigging, talk a bit about effects, set dressing, and finish with lighting and rendering. And then within these streams, I'm going to dive into a few of these assets or these blocks and explore how I made them and eventually plug them into the larger scene. So my hope here is to demystify the process of doing something like this all in Houdini. So the contest was announced August 1st, but I didn't get started until the 3rd. A little late, but whatever. So day 1, and let's jump into modeling and texturing. I'm going to start with the cliffs. Now, we're all Houdini users here, I'm guessing, and so we've probably seen how to make a rock or a cliff generator. But adding Copernicus to the process creates a much more complete workflow. So before I jump into the cliff creation, I wanted to go over the workflow on how to get your point attributes into Copernicus. So you import your geometry, right? Use a rasterized setup to convert the geo to UV space, and then use a rasterized geo to turn those attributes into 2D textures you can then use inside of Copernicus. This will all make a little bit more sense in just a sec. So to create the base of the cliff, it's just a standard procedural modeling operation. Just copy a bunch of primitives to some points, merge them together with VDB, convert to geo, auto UVs, and displace with some noise fields with VOBs. And at the end there, I'm measuring curvature and thickness to create a few more attributes I can work with in COPS. And right there is the end result. Now, what's really cool about all this is that you can utilize the same attributes you used to model your cliff and output those attributes to texture your asset, Copernicus. So here I'm taking those 3D noise fields I used to actually model the cliff, and I'm just quickly plugging them into the geometry's color channel just to visualize what they look like. And those blue nodes are me outputting those attributes. So here's the actual COP network for the cliff, where you can see I'm bringing in all those attributes I created before. And with those attributes, I can remap the colors, I can use them as masks, height fields, whatever. And this is also a great technique to avoid any UV seams, as the attributes are placed directly onto the points in 3D space. And of course, the whole process is completely procedural. So to generate a new cliff, all I had to do was just go to the top level of my node network and change the seed on the scatter. And everything, including the textures, were just updated automatically. So okay, I'm in LOPs, right? So I need to turn these into components so I can use them in my LOP network. So within the LOP network, there is a component builder recipe to start the process of building a component. And this is the basic setup, right, for building a component in Solaris. So within the component geometry, you import your geometry, you build your materials in the material library. Those materials get applied in the component material node. Then you save out your component in the output. So this is where you would add your component to the asset catalog. So once I saved out my cliffs and their textures, I added them to the asset catalog and brought them into the scene using the layout LOP and assembled my final cliff face. Pretty simple. So August 12th, I had that all finished up, and I had to start on the wagon. So the wagon was modeled in Houdini, but I'm going to skip all that and just focus on the texturing process because I thought that was a little bit more interesting. But for those of you who care, this is what my node network looked like for modeling the wagon. And I found this kind of interesting how it sort of like mirrors the overall project setup, right? Just kind of like working in streams and then eventually collapsing everything down into a single asset. I think that's pretty cool. Now, I knew the wagon needed to look like the kids found a bunch of pieces of scrap 2x4s. And I wanted each plank to look like old painted wood, but for each plank to have a different color. So here you can see me randomizing the color of each plank and turning that into a color attribute I could then use within COPS. So this right here is that randomized color turned into a texture map. I created a noise map to get the look of peeling paint. Used a wood texture from Polyhaven as a base, and using the noise map as a mask, overlaid the paint texture on top of the wood, and I used that same noise texture as, for the specular and normal maps to finish off the look, and just exported everything, and I was pretty much done with that. So for the engine, I really didn't want to deal with any UVs, so that meant no Copernicus for the most part, because of the complexity of the model, right? I didn't want to try to unwrap this thing. But fortunately, there are other ways to texture your model in Houdini. So I created a procedural shading network within Karma. So to start off, I knew I wanted the engine to have several different materials. So I sectioned the model into separate groups metal, rubber, chrome, copper, and added color to each group. So that would serve as my color, but also masks. And then I created point attributes I could then use within my Karma shading network. So, ambient occlusion, edge is always important when you're doing metal, and then a directional mask for, some like dust settling on top of the engine there. So inside the Karma material, I created a hextile triplanar using a grunge texture I had on disk, and brought all my point attributes and used those as masks for specularity, color, to make this thing look like it was made from a bunch of different materials, right? And this is all one material. So, I mean, this resembles a Copernicus texture workflow, really. It's just the main difference here is that the material is fully procedural. So after the modeling and texturing were done, I then had to somehow bring the model into Solaris, which meant saving it out to a USD asset, while keeping in mind this needed to be animated. So after a bit of researching, I learned about structuring a proper hierarchy for a USD asset or a USD character that's going to be animated. So the node chain on the right here was the setup that I used to create the hierarchy for all of my characters, right? So you import the geo, create the materials, assign materials, and place everything under a primitive. I repeated this a lot. And there on the left is the final hierarchy structure I used for all of my characters. So again, this is the hierarchy of the USD asset in LOPs in Solaris. So I repeated the same process for all the characters in the scene, and I created the same hierarchy for each character, turning them into their own USD assets. So, I mean, being new to USD, I was a little mystified by this process at first, but once I did it a couple times, I got the hang of it, but I still hadn't animated anything yet. So that was a looming problem that I would eventually have to figure out. So August 16th, halfway through the month, and I started on the clothing. So while the clothing was modeled in Marvelous Designer, all of the texture baking and material creation was done using Copernicus. So a lot of Copernicus in this project. So I sculpted the high-resolution details of the clothing directly in Houdini. And this was nice for the vest because it actually shared the same UV space as the low-res model. So instead of doing a baking operation, right, from high to low, I just created the textures directly on the high-res vest, and along with some custom point attributes, and exported the textures for the low-resolution vest. So this is the base setup for the baking workflow, okay? So I'm going to go in a bit and talk about how I made the shirt for the other character, but I just wanted to go over this really quick. So this is baking in COPS, right? So this looks a lot like the substance painter workflow that you may or may not be used to. So really simple, you just import your low-res and high-res geometry and a cage mesh, if you have one, and then you just plug all of this into the bake geometry textures node, and then you're done. And pretty simple, and really, I mean, there's a recipe for this as well, so you can get started really fast. So the shirt was made by baking the high-res details to a low-resolution mesh. So I started out by using some extracted geometry to create the black detailing, sculpted some finer details on the high-res mesh, and then I used 3D fonts, combined those together, and then just ray casted them directly onto the shirt, and use that combined high-resolution geometry to create the final textures. And now this is amazing because you could do all this directly within the software. I just thought about, hey, would this work? And it worked. So again, to have that Substance Painter workflow, or Substance Painter and Substance Designer workflow directly in Houdini is just absolutely marvelous. Okay, so August 15th, if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed that we went back a day. But I did start the rigging and animation before I started the clothing. Like I said, it was just me. I had very little time, so I was doing several things at once. Okay, cool. This is the fun part, right? So you might have realized now that one of the biggest advantages to rigging a character in Houdini is that once you have a rig, you've essentially created a tool that can be used over and over and over again. So in this case, with these CC4 characters, character creator, CC4, they come with their models attached to a skeleton, right? So a lot of attributes and everything like that. So they're almost ready to go. They just don't have a control rig. So once I rigged that skeleton, I had all of my characters rigged. So here you can see me playing with the final rig here. And what's so cool is that I can easily just collapse the whole setup down to a single node and just copy and paste it and use it for my other characters. So there's no plugins here, right? There's no Python scripting. This is all just vanilla Houdini, the vanilla auto-rig components that come with Houdini 21. And in this project, there were 4 characters in total, so this saved a ton of time. Okay, now this is pretty interesting. The wagon rig was pretty simple, but that's thanks to a new component that was released in Houdini 21 called fused graph. I'm not sure if anybody's heard about this yet, but I'm very, very excited about this one. So basically what this does is it closes the gap between creating manual prototypes and creating your final rig. So that was a big problem in Apex, and we've gone a lot further in solving that particular issue. So this is just a quick demonstration of the rig. I set up an FK rig, really simple. Then I use fused graph to create the custom behavior for the wheels. And along with that, I added some custom shapes using the new Labs Simple Shapes node, which is super awesome. You can really decorate your rigs using that node. So that was the final rig there. But the main bulk of the wagon rig was created by using this fused graph method. So on the left, I have, I don't know if you can see it, but I got the body root and the turning handle going into a couple of custom subgraphs that I made. I made one and just copied and pasted it. I mean, again, this is all directly working within the actual Apex graph. And I have those passed to the rotation channels of the shock absorber joints. And on the right there is the actual Apex setup, where I created the custom graph within an Apex graph node, and then passed all that into an auto rig component, and then fused it back into the rig. So very, very cool stuff. Now, once I had my rigs, it came time for animation. And this is the part that I was dreading from the very beginning, because I didn't know how to do this, right? Like, you know, after a couple of false starts on how to properly set this up, this is the workflow that I eventually landed on, okay? So this block is where all of the character animation and scene took place. This specific node, right, I'm gonna do that again, that node right there is where all the animation lived in SOS. And all of the animation existed on just these 3 nodes, okay? So instead of packing all the animation to a single node, I focused on each individual character within their own node. And this made animating an otherwise complex scene a lot more stress-free. And this is one of the things I love most about animating in Houdini, is that you can work this way, frankly. And now one thing to keep in mind here is that the process of modeling, rigging, and animation, it's all procedural. So the top left, rough animation on the top left there, that shares the same rig and animation as the final wagon on the bottom right. Now, I never re-rigged or re-animated anything. The models, the rigs, and all the animation, they all grew in complexity parallel to each other. So I never had to worry about changes to the model or to the rig, because I knew the animations would just update to each change to the model or to the rig. And now the typical pipeline, right, usually starts with modeling, moves on to rigging, and then goes to animation. Now, if there's a required fix at the modeling stage, you typically have to start the whole process over again, right? Like, rigging fixes can be cumbersome and will oftentimes break the existing animation. But in Houdini, the process is so much more flexible. You can bounce back and forth between modeling, rigging, and animation, not worry about data loss. The rigs are procedural, and the animation will update to any changes in the rig or the model automatically. So here, I'm showing how I connected the characters to the wagon with a series of constraints, and essentially created a larger rig directly in the viewport. So these constraints, they're easy to create, they're easy to remove. You can bake them in separate layers, animate right on top of them. And now the actual process of animating in Houdini, and again, this is someone who animated in Maya for more than 10 years, it all feels very familiar. All the basic hotkeys are there, the rigs are quick and they're responsive, and Apex has gotten a lot more solid over the past few releases. Okay, now on to the part that was really freaking me out from the beginning, was how to get these animated characters to drive their USD counterparts in Solaris. Okay, what I knew I needed to do was at least import my USD characters, right? So I did that first, And you can see they're all stacked on top of each other. But I knew I needed to recreate the hierarchy for each animated character, right? So I imported the animated characters one by one, recreated their hierarchies by placing each in their own prim, just like I did with their USD counterparts. And then I plugged everything into a sublayer node, and holy crap, it worked. I'm not really sure what I was so worried about. Okay, cool. So August 26th. I'm really getting close to the deadline here, and I haven't even started my wings. So I finished all the character animation, but like this was a big one. You know, I knew I wanted this from the very beginning, but I wanted to kind of single these out because Apex isn't the only way to animate characters or objects in Houdini, and the wings are a very good example of this. So my goal here was not to overcomplicate the wagon rig. I didn't want the wings underneath the wig with the characters, and so what I really wanted to do was create the whole thing separate, animate it, run a vellum sim, texture it, and just attach it later. And I had to do this very fast. So after I had modeled the wings, I created a simple rig with kinefx. I used a rig pose to create the closed position for the wing joints and animated between those positions with a skeleton blend, okay? And I passed all that into the bone form, and then I had my base animation. After that, I imported the animated wagon skeleton and extracted just the root joint. Then, with an attribute wrangle, I removed all of the translation in the Z and the Y axis, just leaving the X translation. So, you're going to see it in just a sec. There you can see a simple expression in Vex on how to do this. So then I copied the whole animated wing rig to that point, then ran a vellum simulation on top of everything. So along with some wind and that X translation, it gave me the motion that I was looking for the cloth. So then I had to recenter everything, right, so that I can constrain it to the bottom of the wagon. So to solve that, I just mirrored the point I had been using all along, and then just copied the entire setup to that point, which canceled out all that X translation. And that's a procedural flex right there, by the way. I don't really know if you can do that in any other softwares, but I digress. And I had my geometry centered and ready to be constrained. And again, here is the result of everything put together. Cool, VFX, Houdini's bread and butter. It's August 25th, and this is actually when I actually started adding a little bit of VFX here. Now, this was not a big visual effects heavy project, but I did want to go over one thing, and that was the engine flame, because I wanted to focus on how Solaris made it really simple to layer up effects and create a larger effect. So the top render is the first concept I had for their engine. I thought it looked too sporadic and distracting. So the second render is the final, where I managed to get that kind of toothy shaping around the rim that I originally wanted. And I also animated the density to burst off when they bump it into the ramp there, and to turn back on when the kid is yanking on that crank there. And then along with some smoke sims and particle sims, I had what I wanted. So the flame itself was pretty simple, just a basic tube converted to a fog via VDB. Then I added a few noise fields and a VOP network to create the toothy effect. Then I promoted those parameters so that they could be animated within the SOP network. Now, I created a couple of different effects, right? Several of them, a smoke sim, particles, and some smaller tertiary smoke effects, and just layered them one by one to create the overall combined effect that I was looking for. And again, you know, I didn't even have to remove the old engine flame either. I just disconnected it and just pushed it off to the side in case I changed my mind later. So very flexible and quick. And now to take this idea even further, the character's clothing simulation followed this same layered approach. So it was so easy to just grab one of my characters, extract a piece of clothing, and just focus just on that piece of clothing. And I did that for all my characters and cached all my vellum simulation just down to a single USD file. And now this is really great because even if you follow a set path, modeling to animation, animation to rendering, you can insert anything you want, wherever you want, whenever you want. And since this is all procedural, it's all non-destructive. You can add or subtract anything, anywhere, as you please. Okay, August 28th, and I had 0 set dressing done. There were 3 days left until the deadline, and I'm losing lots of sleep by this point. So, but by now I knew a lot more about how Solaris worked, so I felt mildly confident that I could actually get this done. And I had worked with instancing in the past a little bit, but not to the scale required for this project. So I had to take what I learned about LOPs and building components to a whole new level. And again, this is the base setup for the component. I had some floral elements on my hard drive from like when Megascans was still a thing. So I decided to convert those into component assets I can use in my LOP network. So I scaled up the component creation process to include variants. And variants are just variations within each component. And if you go into one of the, if you're going closer to one of these components, such as the blue flower perennial, I'm importing all of the different geometry variations that I had on disk, merging them into a component geometry variance node, and then that creates my component with all of its variants. So this right here is a very useful little node called explore variants, and it kind of lays out all the different variants of your component. So it's easy to get a clear picture of your component and what it's made up of. But this node does other things as well, as we're about to find out. So this is the base process I use to scatter my components over the landscape geometry. So I start by putting down an instancer. So in this case, we're just going to use a sphere. And on top of the sphere, I'm going to put, or under the sphere, I'm going to put a scatter in a line. And in this case, use a scatter in a line. It's better than scatter. And I'm going to use, what did I use right there? Yeah, just the point count. So now that I have the points, I can start adding some random attributes onto those points. So in this case, I'm going to have a p-scale attribute, right? That always adds a lot of variety. Okay, so now I'm going to jump back out. Now I need a component to work with, right? So you can just drop it, just drag and drop it right into your scene. You connect it to the instancer, so I got to bring that above the instancer and connect it. And once I open up the instancer, it's ready to go. So in this case, I'm going to plug this into the lights to get something better to look at. So now I'm going to put down that explore variance node again, and look what happens. So that just iterates over all the points and selects a random variant for each point. So now I'm going to pin the viewport so I can jump back into stops, and now I can just start playing with my point attributes. And so, I mean, just look how fast it is. I mean, this is all real time, like, you know, really fast, really powerful, and I gotta say the viewport lighting looks pretty good. So I use that same technique to create the points for the actual hill here. So I use a combination of attribute VOPs for creating natural looking noise patterns, and then turn that into a density attribute. Then an attribute paint to refine that same density attribute, and then I scattered points onto that density attribute. So I repeated that process and created points for each component, right? So I had a rock, I had a couple different flowers, I had grass, and added each instance component separately, building up the complexity of the scene little by little. So the exact same process I used to create visual effects. Now, instancing doesn't need to just apply to static objects on static points. It can be animated objects on animated points. And the flock of birds is a good example of this. So I made a simple model of a bird. I rigged it and animated it in Apex, and then I used the motion mixer to cycle the animation a few times. Now here's the final setup in LOPs on putting it all together. So I created the animated points in a SOP create, created the bird, that bird that you just saw before, that was in a different SOP create, and then I cached out the bird, plugged that into an instance, which imports that, the animated points on the top left up there, and then used a retime instances to offset the instance birds, right? So to offset their animations. And once I was done, I just plugged it into my scene, so it's just another layer, same process as before. And again, here is the final result of everything put together. Okay, August 16th, that's when I actually had my first render, and I just obviously worked all the way up to the very last minute. And I mean, if you look at the node network, you can kind of see like everything's sort of falling apart. Like there's a ton of last minute changes and last minute renders. But beyond all that, I just wanted to focus for a sec on just that little jumble of nodes right there. So I was able to reduce all of my previous streams, background animation, set dressing, even the vellum animation down to single USD files. So being new to Solaris, it took me about a week or two before I discovered you could actually work like this and reduce huge amounts of data, and like a variety of data too, like animation, models, lighting, visual effects, down to just single USD files. So once I figured this out, I was obsessed with this process, but I still wasn't done because it's August 29th and I needed extra lighting for my characters, right? I needed to make a lighting setup. I needed to learn how to use light linking, and I needed to create the light rig and then constrain it to the wagon. And this is all things that I've never done before, and I have 2 days. So this is something I knew I needed early on because I felt the lighting looked a bit boring without the extra lighting, right? I didn't really like how it was looking. So I picked a specific frame and set up the lighting in a way that I liked. Then I had to figure out light linking and how to constrain that whole setup to the wagon so it moved along with the actual characters. And again, it was actually really simple. So I just picked a frame, 31, and created my lighting setup in a way that I liked. I imported the wagon skeleton into a SOP create and extracted the root. So this is the exact same process that I used to constrain the wings to the bottom of the wagon. And then I point constrained the light rig to that wagon point, but that's within LOPs. That's the actual point constraint within LOPs. And to finish it all off, I just used a light linker to make sure the lights only affected the animated characters. So again, you know, kind of worried going into this, but it ended up being very simple. And so, late at night on August 31st, I had my final render. And you know, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I wonder if before Houdini 20, I would have been able to do this. And I mean, let alone Houdini 21. I mean, the additions of Solaris, Apex, and Copernicus have like suddenly turned Houdini into this software that's capable of handling any part of the 3D pipeline. And as a 3D generalist and a big fan of this software, it's something of a dream come true. And best of all, you get this unified workflow where whatever it is you're working on, the workflow follows the same overall pattern. So for instance, an entire character in the rig can be collapsed down to this. You can take an entire animated scene with multiple characters, motion paths, etc., and collapse it all down to this. Then you can take multiple animated characters, all with multiple objects and effects, what have you, and collapse it all down to this. And you can use the same approach in each part of the pipeline. So everything works the exact same way. Now, I know a lot of you here are very deep into Houdini, and some of you may be thinking of better ways I could have approached a lot of these certain things. And please let me know, you know, we're all students here. And I'm sure here at Equinox, you know, I'm preaching to the choir about how great this software is. But I mean, I hope to accomplish just a few things with this talk. And one is to just demystify the process of building an entire animation within Houdini, right? That is going from nothing to a finished product and assembling everything within Solaris. And then two, which I think is more important, is to show a different way of looking at this software. Is not as Houdini as being a part of the pipeline, but as the pipeline itself. This kind of singular place and tool for telling whatever story you can come up with. And I think in the first time, I think I can say this, you're able to do all of this in this software. Now, as for the Rampage Rally Challenge, I didn't make it in. Like I said, it's not easy. But after I saw what everybody made, I didn't even care. I mean, it's so ridiculous what people are coming up with these days. But you know, if you guys are curious, I would suggest trying your hand at the next challenge. In my opinion, there's no better way to increase your ability than by putting your work alongside some really, truly amazing 3D artists. It's a very humbling experience, and at times it can be very painful, but you really get a lot better in a very short amount of time. And while you're at it, give Houdini a try. I don't think you'll regret it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Any questions before you leave, Max? Yes, Smai.
Hey Max, amazing.
What's up, Mike?
I obviously got a chance to see your animation beforehand, but I think the talk is even more impressive going through the process. One thing I noticed that it's very courageous of you to try to take on a challenge while learning new things at the same time. Did you find it easy to find resources to learn the different steps that you need to accomplish your task?
Well, I mean, some of them. You know, I would say the animation part of it, sublayering, there is a reason I was so frightened by that one, because there's very little information on that. I think there was like a tutorial from Adam Swab a while ago on how to do that, but it was like just one little part of the tutorial. So yeah, I think I mean, part of the reason I did this, but again, it was to just show like, okay, you do this, you do this, you do this, and to actually put together something within like an entire project, right? Because a lot of the learning material out there, I think, is sort of segmented, right? And it's kind of difficult to find, you know, like the A to Z sort of thing. But you know, I think when it comes to just finding certain things, I mean, I got it done. You know, I did it. I was able to do it, right? So I mean, the learning material is out there. But yeah, I think there could be more of it.
I agree. Other questions, Comax? Going once, going twice. Awesome, Max. Thanks for taking us through that.
Yeah.
Great job.
Thanks, Chris.